Hi there, and welcome to the first of what will be quite a few lecture videos for your weekly modules as we go through this course. So in week one, we're going to keep things pretty light with just a nice overview of nonprofit management as a profession and as a field of study. Like, why do we have this class? Why do we need to talk about nonprofit management differently from any other management class? So this week's topic, I hope you come away from it with a good understanding, a definition of what a nonprofit organization is. So we're going to touch on that this week, and next week we're going to get into it when we learn about the sector. We're going to get into that a lot more. But we're going to start with a basic definition today. We're also going to define management. We're going to describe the differences between management in the nonprofit sector and in others, how nonprofit management has grown and become this distinct field of study, and some of the external forces that have led to that. So let's just start talking about some nonprofit organizations. You're probably familiar with some pretty big national organizations like the Red Cross and the American Cancer Society and the Heart Association. We often see, blood drives, but also whenever there's a disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, or something going on internationally, we're often asked to donate to the Red Cross. Throughout the Hudson Valley, there are often, fundraising walks to support the American Cancer Society or the Heart Association. And then there are local nonprofits such as the SPCA, sorry about that, Hudson River Housing, Vassar Brothers Medical Center. If you belong to a religious organization and go to a house of worship, those are almost all of them are nonprofit organizations. Arts organizations like the Bardavon or Spark Media, all great nonprofit organizations, as is Dutchess Community College. So most colleges and universities are nonprofit organizations as well. So it really, when we talk about nonprofit organizations, and again, we're going to talk about the sector in much more detail next week, but it really encompasses a breadth of types of organizations. Again, just like regular management, we can be talking about a hair salon, how to manage and run a hair salon business or a landscaping business, or we could talk about Google and Apple and Nike. So what is a nonprofit organization? The idea of a nonprofit organization is defined by the Department of Treasury, the Internal Revenue Service, and then within each state, but our concern is New York State. So within the Attorney General's office, there is a charities bureau. And so in terms of the nonprofit organizations are corporations. Right. So, a business can be set up, a for-profit business can be set up as a sole proprietorship or a partnership, or there's different types of a C corporation, an S corporation, and so forth. All nonprofit organizations are incorporated. So they are corporations. They're just corporations that are not set up they don't have owners. They don't have shareholders who are making a profit, making money off of or hanging on to a piece of the organization's profit. So again, we're going to get a lot more into those details in coming weeks. But in the short term, nonprofit organizations as defined by the federal government are organizations that are operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, educational, or other specified purposes. And New York State pretty much follows, the definition in New York State is, I've summarized it. It's a longer, more cumbersome, but essentially it's the same thing. An organization set up for a charitable purpose, such as a charity to collect money for educational purposes, religious, scientific, literary, cultural, etc. So let's talk about what the impact of nonprofit organizations are. And I'm going to be sharing this exact same visual next week. But we know that There are 1.6 million nonprofit organizations in the United States, also referred to as charitable organizations, also referred to as tax-exempt 501c3 organizations. But there are 1.6 million of them, and their employees represent 10% of the United States workforce. So that is only behind manufacturing and retail. So the charitable sector is the third largest workforce in the United States, providing more than 11 million jobs. Now, there are also plenty of volunteers. More than 25% of U.S. adults volunteer, put in some amount of volunteer time at a nonprofit organization. And those 63 million volunteers contribute 193 billion in value. You know, the time that they put in can be valued at $193 billion, and their work generates $24 per hour in value. So just some numbers here to show you that one of the reasons that we study nonprofit management is because it represents 1.6 million organizations, 10% of the U.S. workforce, 25% of U.S. adults who volunteer at an organization, and $390 billion was donated to nonprofit organizations in 2016. So I'll be looking for a more updated number. The COVID pandemic has certainly affected that. In a lot of different ways. A lot of where money is donated has shifted. But, you know, this is a pretty significant part of our U.S. economy, and it's worth studying. It deserves its own course and its own course of study. And there are graduate schools. There's not a lot of undergraduate programs in nonprofit management, but there are graduate degrees in nonprofit management for those who think maybe someday in the future you might be interested in getting a lot deeper into this career. All right, so what's different, right? Why do nonprofit organizations need to be managed in the first place? Again, they are, you know, some nonprofit organizations have one person, just like some businesses, and other nonprofit organizations like the American Red Cross or the American Cancer Society have tens of thousands of employees across the country, raise tens of millions of dollars. So they need to be managed, and they need to be managed well, because they are operating, you know, someone is donating money to them and then they are providing a service. And so they need to be good stewards of that money and make sure that the money is put to good use and that the organization is serving its mission. So before we can really, though, talk about nonprofit management and what makes it different and why it's distinct as a profession, we should just take a step back and define management. And so if you have taken a management course at DCC or elsewhere, you've probably learned that management can be defined as people as well as a process. So when we define management as people, we're talking about those specific individuals who have responsibility and authority, two really important things, responsibility and authority to determine the overall direction of an organization. So the people in charge. And we want those people, just like in, you know, whether you are in a nonprofit organization or you are a manager at Google or Nike or any other, you know, corporation, Amazon, we want managers, those people with responsibility and authority to determine direction of the organization. We want them to be honest and trustworthy. We want them to have very good communication skills, which includes good listening skills. We want them to have leadership and have a vision for the organization. We want them to make decisions, but we want them to make good, sound, ethical decisions, and to accept accountability when maybe the decision they made wasn't the right one. We want managers to have good problem-solving skills, to develop and encourage employees and be a good boss. We want them to be confident. And of course, we want managers to be effective, efficient, and sustainable, in that you're not just a good manager once in a while, that you are a good manager all the time. So we can also define management as a process. You might be familiar with the 4 functions of management, the processes of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling people and resources to effectively meet the organization's goals. So when we talk about planning, we talk about determining a course of action. Organizing is saying, okay, we have a plan. Now let's organize people and resources around that plan so that we can implement it. Leading, not all managers are leaders. Not all leaders are good managers, but part of management is leadership, and that is motivating people and, having a shared vision. And then controlling, not in the bad way, but monitoring, evaluating, doing some performance measurement. And so I have a little bit more of a definition of each of those 4 functions of management. And if you go to your weekly module in the course resources, there are also 2 readings about just to remind you of our definition of management that go into it with a little more detail for those who need a refresher. So let's talk about nonprofit management as a distinct profession. It is different, right? There are so many things that are the same. I just listed some great skills and characteristics that we want in managers, regardless of whether they're in a for-profit business or a nonprofit organization. But there are also some key differences. So, a couple of things when we just look at how a business is structured. A typical business gets revenue from sales. They're selling a product or they're selling a service. A nonprofit organization may sell products and services or charge something for their products and services, but they generally have many other sources of revenue. Nonprofit organizations receive government grants at the federal and the state and the local level. Nonprofit organizations receive grants from charitable foundations, and like the Bill Gates Foundation and his soon-to-be ex-wife runs a foundation, and Jeff Bezos, his former wife, got billions of dollars in the divorce settlement and has been donating money through her foundation. And then individuals, you and I, support nonprofit organizations. We might donate $20 here. We might be asked to simply round up at the grocery store to help support some charitable organizations. So multiple sources of revenue. Most businesses have, pretty fixed goals in terms of, Coca-Cola wants to sell beverages. Nike wants to sell sports equipment, and they might, update their goals every couple of years. But in the nonprofit sector, those goals can be variable because it may depend on the environment. So many organizations, for example, a food bank certainly has, some overarching goals, but then they have to respond to things that are happening in the community. Was there if there was a community that got struck by an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado, then their goals might change to address some really acute, immediate needs versus longer term needs. Nonprofit organizations, in terms of organizational design and the actual structure, tend to be a little bit less structured because they tend to have smaller staff who have to take on lots of different roles. So one of the things I've personally enjoyed when I worked in the nonprofit field is I may have had a title, but my opportunity to grow in my job and do lots of different things because, I may have been doing 2 or 3 jobs, whereas in the business sector, you might have one person doing a job, though not as much anymore. And while, the business sector, everybody who works towards the corporate goal gets paid. Might not get paid enough, but they get paid. In a nonprofit sector, you have a mix. You have paid staff and you have volunteers. But those volunteers could be on the board of directors, or those volunteers can be people who come in and help with office work and other types of things. So a few kind of structural or administrative differences. But 4 key differences that really distinguish nonprofit management as a profession. The first is the trade-offs that have to be made. Most corporations have a mission. We learn about that in our intro to business and business organization and management courses. But with a nonprofit, the mission is everything. Everything you do, every decision you make is focused on that mission. In a corporation, you're really more taking a look at what is our strategy for the next 2 to 3 years? What's our strategic plan? So as an example, JetBlue has a mission statement to bring humanity back to air travel. And that's really nice. And it's a lovely mission. And it's, the idea of that is, all of their decisions around travel and all of their strategies should be focused on making customers happy and comfortable. But if we looked at the mission statement of the Food Bank of the Hudson Valley, their mission statement is to alleviate hunger and prevent food waste. And so the idea, so the trade-offs that then have to be made, JetBlue can say, well, our mission is important, but we have to make we have to make money for our shareholders. The Food Bank of the Hudson Valley says we have to alleviate hunger and prevent food waste here in the Hudson Valley above all else. So we're not going to, our strategy must reflect that mission. And sometimes you might not have enough money. You're not trying to make money for shareholders. So you're just 100% focused on that mission. The stakeholders can be different. In a corporation, you have employees, you have suppliers, you have shareholders. There are a number of stakeholders. In the nonprofit world, there are so many more stakeholders because now you have donors, you have clients, you have the community at large, you have your employees, you have volunteers. So just who the stakeholders are and the types of stakeholders can be very, very different. Nonprofit organizations truly have a double bottom line. Everything is about mission. They have programs that are serving various communities, programs and services, as well as advocacy. So, for example, at the Food Bank of the Hudson Valley, they are providing food. For example, they provide food for the pantry at DCC. They have all different types of programs and services. And in addition to that, they're advocating. Around awareness for hunger. They're advocating for programs and different things to alleviate hunger and poverty, while also trying to maintain a bottom line. They're trying to, manage and always increase their income through, paid services as well as donations and expenses. They can't not think about that. They'll go bankrupt. So there is that idea of a double bottom line. Whereas in a corporation, the bottom line is financial. Now, we certainly can talk about things like a triple bottom line where a corporation should look at people, planet, and profit. But at the end of the day, it's the financial bottom line at corporations. And it's equally the mission related bottom line. How many people did you serve through your programs and services? What has been the impact of your advocacy work? That is as important as your financial bottom line. And then the significance and size of problems addressed. So again, we can look at JetBlue. I would certainly be unhappy if JetBlue went out of business. I like flying JetBlue. I think it is a comfortable airline. I think they do live up to their mission of bringing humanity back to air travel. But, if JetBlue goes away, JetBlue goes away. If the food bank of the Hudson Valley goes away before poverty is ended, right? So they have this huge problem that they are trying to solve here in this community. They're not trying to end poverty around the world, although I think they would very much like that to be an outcome. They'd like to be part of that outcome. But this, we would, as a community, we would be hurting as a community if the food bank of the Hudson Valley stopped operating. We might be inconvenienced if JetBlue stopped operating. So that size and significance of the types of problems that they address is really, I think, the key distinct profession, the key distinct difference that really supersedes the previous three. Right, so still, I don't know that we've answered the question of why management is important in nonprofit organizations. So one of the reasons that we study nonprofit management is because the whole landscape of nonprofit organizations, of operating a nonprofit organization, has actually changed quite a bit in the last 20 to 30 years. And it isn't business as usual. Organizations, nonprofit organizations around the country, and I can really only speak to nonprofit organizations in the US. Certainly there are organizations throughout the world, but I happen to know more about the ones here in the US. That's what I've studied. They have seen increased demand for their services. And increased competition. Those 1.6 million nonprofit organizations in the U.S. are not 100% distinct from one another. So there are many organizations that serve similar needs in the community. But the increased demand, much of that is driven by the fact that a lot of government funding has been reduced or eliminated. There are programs and services that, 40, 50 years ago, the government might have funded, but they have cut back and relied on nonprofit organizations to take over. There is also incredible competition for donations. Again, there is more than one arts organization here in the Hudson Valley. There are more than one nonprofit hospital here in the Hudson Valley. There's more than one college and university. There's more than one food bank. There's more than one organization providing services for the homeless. And so there's only so many people who only have so much money to donate. And so each organization, has to work really hard to attract donations. Both from individuals, but also from corporations, as well as foundations. And when we start talking about foundations that provide funding for other nonprofits in a few weeks, we'll talk about how each foundation has a particular focus. Because just like any other kind of business, you can't be all things to all people. And many, many foundations, as well as many individuals, think, I would rather focus. I don't have that much money to give away, or even if I have billions to give away, I want to make an impact by giving a select few organizations as much money as possible. That's why you have a discussion question asking you, what organization would you give $25 to, and what organization would you give $1 million to? And it might be the same for you, and it might be different. However, with all of this competition, with all of this increased demand for services, with the fact that government has sort of turned some society needs over to nonprofit organizations, there has been an increased demand for accountability. People want to see results. As we've gotten to be a wealthier country, and as individuals, we have we work hard for our money, and when we donate it to an organization, we want them to be accountable. We want to know that they are spending our money on the programs and services. And there's also an emphasis on increasing capacity and sustainability in nonprofit organizations. And so all of that has led to an increased demand for professionalizing management. 50, 60, 70 years ago, most nonprofit organizations were probably led by a volunteer, whereas now, of those 1.6 million nonprofit organizations, the overwhelming majority, and I don't know the number, but I'd certainly like to find out, the overwhelming number of them are operated and managed by paid staff. Just a little bit more background. You may know that management became in the late 1800s. People started actually studying management as our country went through the Industrial Revolution, and we stopped having an economy that was based on agriculture, and we started having an economy that was based on building things. Scholars started taking a look at management, and that's when the ideas of scientific management came along. And so at the time, there was no particular need to distinguish an actual for-profit business from any other type of organization. But around the 1960s, they started to recognize some key differences. And that makes sense because we had a real social revolution in the 1960s. And so there were a lot more people involved in social justice and social change. And so more organizations started popping up. And, people who studied business and studied organizations and studied management said, hey, there really is some differences here. And in the 1970s, they started to really identify things that were unique to nonprofit management. The 1980s just saw so much change in how the government, what the government was going to pay for and in terms of services, and what they were going to outsource to the nonprofit sector. And so by the 1990s, scholars and academics and management experts started paying a lot more attention to the nonprofit field and nonprofit management. And out of that, kind of two schools of thought emerged, and the idea of social entrepreneurship, so that managers in nonprofit organizations started seeing themselves as entrepreneurs. And so one school of thought was, hey, let's take a look at business methods, and let's try to generate some earned income. Yes, we take donations, but maybe we can start selling things too, and maybe we can start collecting data and acting a lot more like a business, right? So that was one, let's really act like entrepreneurs. And there was another school of thought, in the 1990s and up through now, that kind of took a look and said, well, let's also just look at new ways to bring about social change. Let's look at innovation. So if we want equality, if we value diversity and equality, we can certainly bring some, business methods to it, but what can we do that's new and different and innovative to bring about the social change that we need? And so then that has evolved to the present day, where there are some organizations and some scholars that look at nonprofit organizations as social institutions that are responsible for preserving social values, and they emphasize process and involvement. So for example, an arts organization might focus on the process of free expression, and that free expression might lead to social change, but they know that eventually the change is going to come, and that it's the process that really matters. And then there are other organizations that do take more of an enterprise perspective, with a very defined mission and defined goals, and really focus on results. So that's the organization, for example, organizations that have really focused on ending police brutality. They want results. They're done talking about process. They want to see results. So, I don't think any organization should one is not necessarily better than the other, and one shouldn't necessarily be done to the exclusion of the other. It is great. There are some organizations that are really effective because they focus on process, but it is still important that that process leads to results. And then, in number two, it's absolutely important to look at results, but you can't get to results without taking a look at the process. So they're both very important. Some organizations and some people who study and are experts in nonprofit management, some like to emphasize one over the other, but they're both absolutely critical to all nonprofit organizations. So finally, one last thing to talk about is careers in the nonprofit field. And throughout this semester, I will be sharing with you as we cover different topics. Certainly in any nonprofit organization, you can be an accountant, you can work in marketing, you can work in human resources, you can work in finance. So some of the typical business fields, right? You could choose and say, you know what? I want to be an accountant, but I really want to work for an organization that's supporting the greater good, which is fine. You can work for an accounting firm. You can work for a nonprofit organization that needs accounting. But there are also some very specific careers within the nonprofit field. Fundraising is one of them. In particular, program management is another one. So as we get through this semester and cover different topics, I will share a little bit about different careers, and I certainly hope and plan to interview and provide some videos of some interviews and discussions with some nonprofit executives. But in general, just know that it is a very rewarding field. In many cases, you're working to enhance human life, and that might be through the arts, that might be through healthcare, that might be through education. Maybe you're working to save animals. It doesn't have to enhance human life. It can enhance other lives too. You might be, many organizations, working on social justice issues. So it's very rewarding work. There are lots of organizations. Idealist is a fantastic organization that is probably one of the top places to look for nonprofit jobs. Nonprofit Talent is a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania-based organization, but it's run by a dear friend of mine who I hope to incorporate into this class. And so if you just are curious as to what kind of jobs are available in the nonprofit field, I believe in Blackboard, when you open up these slides, you can click on a live link. And I can certainly add those links as well. And then finally, these are also in Blackboard, but there are two videos that just show two really key careers. One is a director of education at an organization, and the other is a fundraising director for, I believe, an international nonprofit organization. And so both will give you some insight into careers and what it means to work in a management type position in a nonprofit organization. So that is all I have for you. I hope that this has piqued your interest in some of the topics that we're going to cover. And I'll be back with you next week. Take care.